Napoleon left the École Royale Militaire, Paris, on the 8th of October 1785. Before heading south to join the Lafayette Regiment at Valence, he went to see his patron, Bishop Marbeuf, whose luxurious quarters were at the Abbey Palace in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Marbeuf gave him letters of introduction to a cleric of equivalent standing in Valence, Monseigneur Tardevin. Although Napoleon was finished with Catholicism, he was still prepared to milk it for worldly advantage. 2 days later he departed southward on the Lyons stage. His route took him through Fontainebleau, Sens, Autun and Chalon-sur-Saône where, on the 1st of November he took the water coach down the Saône to Lyons. He completed his journey by post-boat and arrived in Valence on the 3rd of November, splendidly arrayed in the uniform of the Lafayette Regiment: blue breeches, blue waistcoat, royal blue coat with red facings, pockets braided in red and epaulettes with gold and silver fringes. He was assigned to the bombardier company of Captain Masson d'Audevrive. The garrison at Lafayette had 7 artillery regiments plus 15 companies of workmen and miners. The Lafayette Regiment had the reputation of being a crack unit. It rose early, worked hard, and drilled as perfectly as an elite infantry regiment. Second Lieutenant Bonaparte was the number 4 man in one of 4 bombardier companies. Each regiment contained 20 companies, 14 of gunners, 4 of bombardiers and 2 sappers. Each company of about 70 men was commanded by a captain with 3 lieutenants under him. In the French system, 5 companies made up a brigade, 2 brigades a battalion and 2 battalions a regiment. Napoleon underwent 10 weeks of basic training, drilling first as a private, then as a corporal and finally as a sergeant. He afterwards paid tribute to this method of learning from the grassroots up and attributed to it his famous common touch. On the 10th of January 1786 he completed his probation as an officer. His duties were scarcely onerous: mounting guard, looking after the men, attending classes on mathematics, fortification, chemistry and physics. There was plenty of free time. From the copious notes Napoleon kept we know a great deal about how he spent his time: climbing Mont Roche-Colombe, skating, visiting the towns of Romans and Tournon. He records that Valence, a town of 000 inhabitants, then chiefly notable for its citadel and a plethora of abbeys and priories, had more than its fair share of pretty women. Girls begin to be mentioned. On the 4th of December 1785, at a fiesta, he danced with a certain Emile Desplaces. He was friendly with a Madame Grégoire de Colombier and her daughter Caroline, though the episode of eating cherries in the countryside with Caroline sounds suspiciously like a Rousseau-esque fantasy. Napoleon's principal problem was money. He had an income of Rzo livres a year, made up of a basic salary of 800 livres, plus sous livres royal bounty and Rzo livres lodging allowance. But because Carlo had died virtually penniless and Letizia had lost the protection of Marbeuf, Napoleon had to remit most of his earnings to Corsica to help his impoverished family. Letizia had a total of Rzo livres a year on which to keep herself and the younger children. Somehow or other she inveigled money for extras out of the notorious skinflint Archdeacon Luciano, who was the family miser. Napoleon therefore had to make do with very basic lodgings. He found a noisy room on the first floor of the Café Cercle, at the corner of the Grand Rue and the Rue du Croissant, where the landlady was a 50-year-old spinster, Emilbu, who washed and looked after his clothes. The room and services cost just over 8 livres. He took his meals in a cheap café named the 3 Pigeons in Rue Parollerie. At Valence, Napoleon launched himself on a career as a would-be writer. He penned a refutation of a book attacking his hero Rousseau. He wrote a story called The Prophetic Mask about an Arab prophet who is defeated after a string of victories and commits suicide along with all his followers. Apart from underlining Napoleon's continuing fascination with the world of the Middle East, the tale and the 16-year-old lieutenant's notebooks testify eloquently at this time to a morbid preoccupation with suicide. How seriously should we take this? Partly it seems a fashionable romantic pose, for Goethe, with his tired-off life melancholia, was a role model for educated young men of the time. But part of Napoleon's reflections on suicide does suggest a genuine pessimism about the world and the beginnings of a depressive illness. He wrote, "Always alone in the midst of men, I return to dream with myself and give myself up to all the force of my melancholy. What madness makes me desire my own destruction? Without doubt, the problem of what to do in this world. Life is a burden to me because I feel no pleasure and because everything is affliction to me. It is a burden to me because the men with whom I have to live, and will probably always live, have ways as different from mine as the light of the moon from that of the sun. I cannot then pursue the only manner of living which could enable me to put up with existence, whence follows a disgust for everything." The uneventful external tenor of life at Valence ended in August 1786 when the regiment was ordered up to Lyons to suppress a strike by silk workers. 3 ringleaders were hanged and the strikers effectively cowed. Napoleon, who had often expressed his homesickness for Corsica, applied for leave and was granted it, to run from October. Since officers in far-flung corners of France were allowed a month's traveling time in addition to leave, Napoleon set out for Corsica as soon as the military intervention in Lyons was complete. At Aix-en-Provence he visited his uncle Fesch, who had not yet completed his theological studies, and also Lucien, who had abandoned Brienne and come down to Aix to be trained as a priest. He finally reached Ajaccio on 5 September 1786, having been absent from the island for nearly 8 years. The reunion with Letizia and great-uncle Lucien was a particularly joyous one, though clouded by the financial shadows that hung over the family. Napoleon was shocked to find his mother doing all the household chores when he arrived home. He inquired about Joseph and learned that, in obedience to his father's wishes, he had given up all hope of a military career and turned to the paternal study, law. Hearing that he was now studying law at Pisa University, Napoleon wrote to him to say that the family honor required that Letizia be relieved of the worst drudgery. Would Joseph therefore bring back a reliable servant? When Joseph came home a few months later, he brought with him the Italian domestic maid Saveria, who remained in Letizia's service for 40 years. To Joseph we owe a meticulous analysis of Napoleon's reading at the time. The classical authors in translation, especially Plutarch, Cicero, Livy, Cornelius Nepos and Tacitus, Macpherson's Ossian, Racine, Corneille, Voltaire, Montaigne, Montesquieu and, above all, Rousseau and the Abbé Raynal. However, all the evidence suggests that Napoleon's reading was wide rather than deep. His knowledge of Rousseau was superficial and he was ignorant of much of Voltaire. He knew little of Montesquieu and less of Diderot. Most surprising of all, he had not heard of Pierre Laclose's Les Liaisons Dangereuses, published 4 years earlier and significant both because it was heavily influenced by Rousseau, and because Laclose, like Napoleon, was an artilleryman. The entente between Napoleon and Joseph was particularly close during this leave. The two brothers held long, animated discussions on all the subjects that fascinated Napoleon. Joseph was said to have remarked later, "Ah, the glorious emperor will never compensate me for Napoleon, whom I love so well, and whom I should like to meet again as I knew him in 1786, if indeed there is a meeting in the Elysian fields." But over both young men a financial shadow continued to hang, and in particular there was the problem of Carlos Mulberry Groves. His investment was predicated on a subsidy from the French government which had been suspended because of financial retrenchment. Joseph had to return to his studies in Pisa, so it fell to Napoleon to try to sort out the implicit breach of contract. On April 1787 Napoleon wrote to Colonel de Lance, his commanding officer in the La Fère regiment, enclosing a medical certificate stating that he was suffering from quartan ague, and requesting an extension of leave on grounds of illness. This was granted readily. Napoleon was informed he need not report back for duty until December 1787. To obtain leave after only 9 months' service and then to be away from the regiment for what eventually turned out to be nearly 2 years suggests an extremely complacent attitude to the professional officer by the ancient regime military authorities, nor does there appear to have been any liaison between government departments, for nobody seemed to have questioned how Napoleon was too ill to be on military duty yet fit enough to make a long journey to Paris to lobby the financial bureaucracy about Carlos Mulberry Groves. Such laxity was common in the prior 789 years. A colonel, for example, was required to be present with his regiment for only 5 months a year. Napoleon's financial mission began when he left Corsica on 2 September 1787. By the beginning of November he was installed at the Hôtel de Cherbourg in the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré in Paris. For the first time he really got to know the French capital. Having been a virtual prisoner at the École Royale, he made the most of his time, visiting as many theaters as possible, with the Italian opera a particular favorite. His audience with the Comptroller General of Finance was abortive. Nothing for the Groves was offered. As if in compensation, Napoleon received the 6-month extension of leave he had requested before leaving Corsica. This time he asked for prolongation on the ground that he wished to attend a meeting of the Corsican estates. Since he did not ask for pay, the request was granted. The most significant event in the 18-year-old Napoleon's sojourn in Paris was that he lost his virginity. On the freezing night of the 22nd of November 1787 he went to the Palais Royal, then the red light district, and picked up a prostitute. The Palais Royal, bordering the Louvre and the Tuileries, had once belonged to Cardinal Richelieu and the Duc d'Orléans. In 1776 the gardens became the property of the Duc de Chartres, a libertine, who engaged the architect Victor Louis to build a theatre. While this was being constructed, a wooden gallery was put up, running alongside the gardens, known as the Camp des Tartares. By 1784 it was notorious for prostitution and petty theft. As the private property of the Duc de Chartres, it was safe from police raids. Meanwhile the theatre itself gradually took shape in the inner area of the Palais, which then became a center for culture in its widest sense, both elite and popular. It was here that Napoleon made his first timid approaches to a fil de joie. he approached one who proved willing to talk about her experiences and what had driven her to this life. Encouraged by her ingenuousness, he took her back to his lodgings. They talked, then made love. Napoleon records that she was slight, slim and feminine, and that she was a Breton, from Nantes, who had been seduced by an army officer. On New Year's Day 1788 he arrived back in Ajaccio. The family's financial situation had worsened if anything, and Letizia still had 4 children entirely dependent on her. In 1788 Louis had his 10th birthday, Pauline her 8th, Caroline her 6th and Jerome his 4th, and in addition there were fees payable for Lucien at the Aix Seminary and Joseph at the University of Pisa. It is remarkable how quickly Napoleon, as the only breadwinner, was accepted as the head of the family, and how Joseph was quite prepared to defer to him. But by the time Napoleon departed from Ajaccio on the 1st of June 1788 he had at least had the pleasure of seeing Joseph return from Pisa with the coveted title of Doctor of Laws. The Lefebvre regiment was by now stationed in Auxonne. Once again Napoleon dedicated himself to a Spartan existence. He lodged near the barracks, at the Pavilion de la Ville, where his room had a single cell-like window and was austerely furnished with just a bed, table and armchair. There was even less to do here than at Valence. An appearance at parade was required just once a week. In this period Napoleon became a genuine workaholic, alternating his writing of apprentice pieces with omnivorous reading, with special emphasis on history, Corsica and the theory of artillery. He was already learning to get by with a minimum of sleep. He rose at 4 a.m., took just one meal a day at 3 p.m. so as to save money, and went to bed at 10 p.m. after 18 hours at his books. The ascetic way of life seriously affected his health. Poor diet, overwork and the cold and damp climate triggered physical exhaustion, which made his body prey to malaria. His only real friends in the barracks were the faithful Desmazis and a Captain Gassendi, who appealed to Napoleon on 3 separate counts, as a man of letters, a distinguished geometer and an admirer of Corsica. But he fell out with an officer named Belli de Bussy. A duel was arranged, but intermediaries forced the 2 officers to compose their differences for the sake of the regiment. Evidently Napoleon did sometimes try the patience of the senior command, for he suffered a 24-hour arrest for reasons unknown. He was shut up in a cell with just a single law book for company, an experience he later claimed was useful when he came to draw up the Code Napoleon. But on the credit side Napoleon attracted the attention of the mathematics instructor, Professor Lombard, who in turn mentioned him to the commanding officer of all troops in Auxonne, Baron Jean-Pierre Dutheil, as one to note. Napoleon acquired an unrivaled knowledge of projectiles and ballistics and also honed his talents as a draftsman. Among the most important influences on Napoleon the theoretician of artillery were the general's brother, Jean de Beaumont Dutheil, whose handbook, published 10 years earlier, stressed the massing of big guns at decisive moments in battle. Napoleon was also influenced by Jacques de Guibert, whose book stressed that a successful army depended on speed and should be prepared to live off the land. Yet another influence was the recently published work by Pierre Berset, which prescribed the separation of army divisions for the purpose of rapid movement, followed by their rapid concentration just before a battle. Such was Napoleon's dedication that in 15 months at Auxonne he filled 36 manuscript notebooks with writings on artillery, history and philosophy. In August 1, 788 he was singled out for his special aptitude and appointed commander of a demonstration company trying to devise ways of firing mortar shells from ordinary cannon. The danger of the work was offset by the opportunity to put favorite theories to the test. Napoleon also became the only second lieutenant to sit on a select regimental artillery committee. On 8 August he wrote to Fesch complaining of fever and warning that his appointment to the committee, over the heads of many captains, had caused considerable irritation and jealousy. Dutheil liked to send his junior officers into the countryside to test their talent at choosing ground and spotting any topographical drawbacks. Often they would be asked to write a situation paper, explaining how a particular hill or village could be attacked or defended. The combination of assiduous fieldwork with voracious reading turned Napoleon into an artilleryman non-pareil. The one obstacle to rapid promotion under Dutheil's benevolent eye was the 19-year-old's uncertain health. There was another protracted attack of fever in the final months of 1788, after which Napoleon wrote to his mother that several fevers had laid him low. In common with most people in the 18th century, who knew nothing of the Anopheles mosquito, he attributed his attacks of malaria to miasmata arising from the nearby river. In similar vein he wrote to Archdeacon Lucien on the 18th of March 1789, "I have no other resource but work. I dress but once in 8 days, I sleep but little since my illness, it is incredible, I retire at 10 and rise at 4 in the morning. I take but one meal a day, at 3, that is good for my health." At the beginning of April in the fateful year 1789 Dutheil received word of grain riots in the nearby town of Suur. Napoleon was among 100 officers and men immediately put on the 20-mile march to Suur to quell the disturbances. The rioters dispersed before the military came on the scene. but Napoleon and the troopers were kept on for 2 months, as a warning against any further uprising. After taking lodgings in the Rue du Lac, Napoleon made his mark with the intendant of Burgundy, who gave a supper for the officers and asked for the young Bonaparte as his personal escort on a horseback ride to Verdun-sur-les-Doubs. On the 29th of May he returned to Auxonne, where he shortly afterwards wrote a famous letter to Paoli, lamenting that he was born at the very moment independent Corsica expired. As the nation was perishing I was born. 30,000 Frenchmen were vomited onto our shores, drowning the throne of liberty in waves of blood. Such was the odious sight which was the first to strike me. From my birth, my cradle was surrounded by the cries of the dying, the groans of the oppressed and tears of despair. You left our island and with you went all hope of happiness. Slavery was the price of our submission. Crushed, why the triple yoke of the soldier, the lawmaker and the tax inspector, our compatriots live despised. Napoleon liked swimming, but in the summer of 1789 he was seized by cramp in the Seine, and nearly drowned. Superstitiously, he linked his own near tragedy with the alarming events taking place that summer in Paris. On 5th of July he wrote to Archdeacon Lucien in high excitement about the astonishing and singular news reaching them. Soon the revolutionary current sweeping France affected Auxonne and even the La Fère regiment. On the 19th of July the local people rose in revolt, burnt the register of taxes and destroyed the offices of a farmer general. The men of the La Fère regiment stood idly by and, a little later, caught the spirit of mutiny themselves. They marched to Dutheil's house, demanded money with menaces, got drunk and compelled some officers to drink with them and dance the farandole. Order was eventually restored, but Dutheil thought it best to break up the regiment and canton it in different locations along the banks of the Seine. Napoleon, who on the 23rd of August took an oath of fidelity to nation, king and the law, apparently confessed that he would have obeyed Dutheil and turned his guns on the mutineers, even though his ideological sympathies were with the revolution. For some time Napoleon had been requesting another period of furlough, and this was eventually granted on 2 August, but after the trouble with his regiment, Dutheil thought that no leave at all should be granted. He was, however, overruled by the provincial governor who sensibly thought that such punitive action would simply increase the sum total of resentment. Napoleon's leave was granted from October but, given the usual months-long distance traveling time, he left for Corsica on the 9th of September. He accompanied the Baron Dutheil as far as Lyons, then continued alone to Valence, where he took the river coach to the mouths of the Rh1. In Marseille he visited his hero the Abbé Raynal before crossing to Ajaccio, where he arrived at the end of September 1789. On this leave, Napoleon began his career as Corsican politician, or troublemaker as his critics would have it. Learning that the new military commander in Corsica, the Vicomte de Baron, was a timid and irresolute man with just 6 battalions at his call, Napoleon trimmed and temporized with the revolutionary faction, now dominant on the island. The politics of Corsica were of quite extraordinary complexity, with personal politics and class conflict overlying clan loyalties and ideological struggle. Early in 1789, the situation had been reasonably clear. To the famous meeting of the Estates General in Versailles went the Comte de Buttafuoco, who had asked Rousseau to write a constitution for Corsica representing the nobility, Peretti della Rocca for the clergy, and for the Third Estate Colonna Cesari and ex Salisti. However, the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 was, for Corsica, like applying a match to a powder keg. On the royalist side the Vicomte de Sérène was soon outflanked by firebrands like his deputy general Gaffori. Corsica largely embraced the revolutionary cause, and the First Constituent Assembly adopted a resolution that the island was no longer conquered territory, but an integral part of France. In February 1790 Salisti was instrumental in getting the Assembly to grant an amnesty to Paoli and invite him to return to the island. This was the context in which Napoleon, together with Joseph, who was turning himself into a professional politician, started to acquire a reputation as a small-time fixer. He was in Bastia in early November 1789, and the fact that a popular rising took place there 5 days after his arrival has always seemed more than coincidence. The first 3 months of 1790 saw him active with Joseph in the election campaigns for the new Corsican Assembly, and on 2 April he and Joseph were present at a 9-hour meeting of the new Assembly at Orizza. It was no wonder that the commander of the Ajaccio garrison complained to the Minister of War in December 1789 as follows: "This young officer was educated at the École Militaire. His sister is at St. Cyr and his mother has received countless kindnesses from the government. This officer had much better be with his regiment since he spends all his time stirring up trouble." On 6 April 1790 Napoleon wrote to Dutheil to request a prolongation of his leave, on the grounds that he was suffering from anemia, and needed to take the waters of Oryza. The request was so clearly bogus that it is surprising that Dutheil granted an extension of 4.5 months with pay until October, but we must remember that by this time he was something of a cynosure with his commanding officer. It was not the water at Oryza Napoleon was interested in, but the hot air of political disputation, for between 9 and the 27th of September he and Joseph were in daily attendance at the Paulistas party conference. The sessions were dominated by Pauli, who, aged 66 and white-haired, had made a triumphant return to Corsica, landing at Bastia on the 7th of July, where Napoleon met him. The assembly held at Oryza halted the growing move for the partition of the island, and settled on Bastia as the capital. The stage was now set for head-to-head conflict in the Corsican assembly between the partisans of Buttafuoco and Pauli. In this tactical battle Salisti decisively outpointed Buttafuoco, and the clerical representative Peretti, the Third Estate and the Paulistas now held the whip hand in Corsica. For the whole of 1790 Napoleon was in effect a Corsican politician. He did try to rejoin his regiment in October, but his ship was driven back to Ajaccio several times by adverse winds. He used the time to get Joseph elected to the Ajaccio Municipal Council, even though the Bonaparte's enemies produced Joseph's birth certificate to show that he was too young to serve. With the Republican majority on the council behind him, Napoleon advocated stern measures against the island's reactionaries, hounding them from office. Napoleon justified under the formula Salus Populi Suprema Lex,